To talk a little bit more about the Ukraine-Russia crisis, we're now joined by our correspondent in Washington, Nick Harper. Nick, a very good evening to you. It's been a day of almost hourly developments on this story. We've heard what the UK Prime Minister has had to say, and we understand that any moment now we're expecting to hear from the White House President Joe Biden's response.
Yeah, absolutely. It has been an hour-by-hour changing situation, much as it was on Monday as well. But Joe Biden was scheduled to speak 1 hour ago. He hasn't appeared yet, but we are expecting some very forceful language from the American president when he finally does turn up to speak about the situation in Ukraine. There was some head-scratching on Monday as to why the swift and severe sanctions that the US had been promising for weeks didn't happen after President Putin announced that he was sending peacekeepers, his term, into those two breakaway separatist regions. In many respects, that was viewed by world leaders in the West as the start of an invasion, and that should have prompted the sanctions as promised. Instead, the US response on Monday was to level sanctions at the two separatist regions, Luhansk and Donetsk, making it impossible for Americans to do business with anyone in those two regions. But the White House didn't put any sanctions on the Kremlin or the Putin government or any other Russian institutions. We are expecting that to change when the US president speaks shortly, and that wide-ranging package of sanctions that has been promised is what he is likely to unveil. Much more severe and significant than what we saw in the last 24 hours. They had promised that they could go as far as cutting off Russia essentially from the financial banking system around the world. And that is something that we could see from the US president when he speaks very soon.
And Nick, this is something that the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson mentioned when he was talking about the imposition of sanctions against 5 banks and the 3 individuals that we mentioned. But pundits have said that these actions by Boris Johnson are a little too weak given the expectations, some even pointing out that it's symbolic because the United States has already imposed sanctions on these banks. Do you think that President Joe Biden will try and talk up the action by the UK?
Well, undoubtedly, he probably will. As we heard in Boris Johnson's statement just a few moments ago, he said that this was the first tranche of sanctions, that there would be more to follow, not just from the United Kingdom, but he said also from the US and other allies. And I think there is that question at the moment. Exactly what President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson and other world leaders should be doing, whether they should be levelling the full range of sanctions now or whether they should be holding some back, almost saving some of their arsenal to use over the coming days if the situation continues to escalate. There have been some suggestions, though, that really the US should go out all guns blazing when it comes to these sanctions. There have been connections and comparisons drawn in the US media over the last 24 hours to the start of World War II, when Hitler started by annexing Austria before moving on to other countries, that slow slide towards war. And there has been the suggestion that if the full range of sanctions aren't used now, there could be continuing escalations over days, over weeks from the Russian president. So there is that desire from some parts in the United States for the US President Joe Biden to go all out when it comes to sanctions and to impose as many as possible, including some against the Russian president himself, something that Joe Biden said that he had been considering.
And not just in the United States, Nick, in Europe as well. Interestingly enough, as you talk about what some call tiptoeing, we've heard from the German Chancellor announcing the suspension of the certification of the Nord Stream gas pipeline with Russia. Those who have expressed their disappointment, saying, why talk about a suspension? Why not go as far as bring an end to it? But I'd imagine that President Joe Biden would rather have a pat on the back for the German Chancellor, given the fact that when he was there, when they last had talks, this was on the agenda and the US president was urging Germany to do exactly this.
Yeah, you're right. Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, was here in Washington at the White House just a couple of weeks ago. He met with Joe Biden. Joe Biden has had reservations for some years about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, as many officials in the US have had. They say that it will essentially tie Europe to Russia and make them reliant on Russia to receive their gas supplies, Germany in particular, as the main recipient of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. Now, a year ago, Joe Biden, when he came into office, essentially gave the green light for the project to go ahead. He removed sanctions that had been in place against the company operating that pipeline project. But within the course of the last couple of months, he has warned that if an invasion were to go ahead, that pipeline would not be allowed to go ahead. He discussed that with the German Chancellor. So yes, undoubtedly, he will be pleased that the German Chancellor has signalled that there is this suspension. But you're right, I think questions as to why they're not simply pulling the plug and saying, look, no more, we're not going to receive this gas, rather than just saying it's a temporary suspension for now for that pipeline project to be going ahead.
So obviously President Biden facing pressure from both sides of the House. You say there's expectation of a tough talk. We saw some tough talk from NATO earlier on, putting squarely the blame of the escalation at Russia's feet. But just how tough can President Joe Biden get? Because it has been said over and over again, war is not desirable, that diplomacy must continue. So how is he going to manage to do that, speaking out of both sides of his mouth? On the one hand, waving a finger at Russian President Vladimir Putin, saying, here and no further, we're going to stop you, while at the same time saying, we're open for talks because this is not important, we cannot afford a war.
It's very tough. I mean, it is a balancing act that the US president is engaged in. Important to note as well, while we consider that this is the biggest foreign policy challenge he's faced yet during his presidency, which has lasted so far just over a year, important to note that he is just a few months out from the midterm elections here in the United States. They take place in November, and there is already a great fear, even before the escalation with Russia, that the Democrats, of which President Biden is a member of that party, that the Democrats would lose both houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and the Republicans potentially winning both of them back in November's midterm. So yes, there will be this concern from Democrats that if the president is not seen to be tough enough against Russia, is not seen to be pushing these sanctions hard enough against the Russian president, then he could face the wrath of voters when it comes to those midterm elections. Voters who feel that he hasn't been tough enough against Vladimir Putin. So he does need to be careful. He needs to say that diplomacy is something that we're still willing to engage in, but at the same time, make it very clear that this invasion, of which the US is now calling it, is something that the US cannot stand beside and watch. Sanctions will be taking place, and the US president, I guess, in some respects, needs to show that he's going hard and fast with the full range of sanctions available to him.
Nick, that huge gulf in a difference of opinion. We've seen the Russian president saying after he received permission to send troops to Donetsk and Lugansk that it's a peacekeeping force. As you say, President Biden calls it an invasion, or at least the workings thereof. There was talk of a summit between the two leaders. Does that mean that all bets are off with regards to this?
Well, interestingly, in terms of the diplomatic next steps, yes, there was a potential meeting planned between the leaders of the two countries, but the idea of that taking place was only based on if Russia had not gone ahead with an invasion. So in theory, that is now off the table. But we are hearing talk in the US media that the meeting between the two foreign ministers, the US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and his counterpart Sergei Lavrov, will be taking place, potentially on Thursday this week. It is interesting to note that we've already had a US official a few hours ago, the Deputy National Security Advisor Jonathan Feiner, using the word invasion, terming what we've seen over the last 24 hours, those Russian troops going into the two separatist regions, as an invasion. It'll be interesting to see whether the president used the same term when he addresses the nation and potentially lays forward that range of sanctions.
All right, thanks for that, Nick. And of course, we will come back to you as and when President Joe Biden addresses the nation in Washington.